The monuments of ancient Egypt, pyramids, temples, and tombs have fascinated the world for centuries, standing as symbols of unmatched ingenuity and ambition. But beneath the familiar story of pharaohs and golden treasures lies a more complex narrative, one shaped by who tells it and what they choose to reveal or conceal. For over a century, the identity of ancient Egyptians was manipulated to fit colonial and racial agendas, severing Egypt from its African roots. Western scholars, under the guise of science, redrew Egypt's place in history, presenting it as a non-African civilization to justify racial hierarchies. This distortion became so widespread that it shaped textbooks, museums, and public understanding, leaving a legacy we are only now beginning to challenge. Scientific racism, led by figures like Samuel Morton, used skull measurements to rank human worth and reinforce racial myths. Theories like the Dynastic Race Theory claimed Egypt's greatness came from outsiders, erasing its African heritage, until scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop fought to reclaim the truth. Today, a new generation of researchers is working to restore Egypt's place within Africa, exposing how power shaped the story we inherited. Early anthropology didn't just study human diversity. It invented racial hierarchies, placing Europeans at the top and using science to justify inequality. Physical traits like skull shape and skin color became supposed markers of intelligence and civilization, reinforcing colonial worldviews. This framework shaped how the West viewed Egypt, turning its ruins into evidence for a biased, exclusionary history. Samuel Morton's skull measurements claimed to prove racial superiority, giving scientific cover to prejudice and oppression. His flawed data was used to justify slavery and deny Africa's achievements, including those of ancient Egypt. Only later did critics expose Morton's biases, revealing that his science reflected the prejudices of his time, not objective truth. When the race scientists of the 19th century turned their gaze toward the Nile Valley, they faced a profound and deeply troubling paradox. Here, on the African continent, the supposed home of the lowest race in their hierarchy, stood a civilization of staggering antiquity, sophistication, and grandeur. The existence of ancient Egypt, with its monumental architecture, complex writing systems, and advanced knowledge of mathematics and medicine, was a glaring and inconvenient contradiction to their entire worldview. How could a people they deemed inherently incapable of high civilization have produced the pyramids and the Sphinx? The evidence on the ground seemed to defy the neat categories being constructed in European laboratories and lecture halls. The solution to this problem was not to question the racial hierarchy itself, but to perform a deft act of intellectual gerrymandering. Instead of re-evaluating their premises about Africa, these scholars simply removed Egypt from Africa in their system of classification. Ancient Egypt was carefully and deliberately assigned to the Caucasian category. Morton, in his Crania Egyptiaca, analyzed skulls from Egyptian tombs and concluded that the ruling class of ancient Egypt, the pharaohs and the priests, were not related to sub-Saharan Africans, but were in fact members of the Caucasian race. He argued that a clear distinction could be made between the skulls of the true Egyptians and those of their black servants or slaves. This crucial decision was not primarily based on a holistic assessment of cultural, linguistic, or even archaeological evidence, much of which pointed to deep connections with other African cultures to the south. Instead, it was based almost entirely on the selective interpretation of skeletal remains and artistic depictions, filtered through the powerful lens of racial bias, The goal was to preserve the integrity of the racial hierarchy by defining the ancient Egyptians as white, or at least as a distinct Hamitic branch of the Caucasian race. Their achievements no longer challenged the narrative of African inferiority. Civilization had not sprung from African soil, the theory went. It had been brought to it by a foreign, superior people. This reclassification had enormous and lasting consequences, effectively creating an intellectual wall between Egypt and the rest of the continent. Egyptology developed as a field largely separate from the study of other African societies. In museums, Egyptian artifacts were typically housed in galleries dedicated to the ancient Near East or the classical Mediterranean world, not with African collections. In universities and popular histories, Egypt was presented as the cradle of civilization that influenced Greece and Rome, but its own African roots were ignored or actively denied. It became an honorary member of the West, its legacy stolen from its native continent to uphold a racist ideology. The racial classifications developed by scholars like Cuvier and Morton were never confined to the ivory tower. They were not harmless academic exercises, but provided the essential moral and intellectual justification for European colonialism during the 19th century's scramble for Africa. These scientific theories fed directly into a powerful and pervasive colonial ideology. The belief that Europeans were not just entitled, but were in fact destined to rule over the less advanced peoples of the world. Race science provided the proof that this was not an act of greedy conquest, but a natural and even noble mission to bring order and progress to supposedly backward and chaotic societies. By framing global inequality as a biological fact rather than a product of history, race science absolved European powers of any guilt. Colonization could be presented as the white man's burden, a benevolent duty to govern those who were supposedly incapable of governing themselves. The denial of Africa's capacity for civilization was a central pillar of this argument. If it could be proven that Africans had never independently created a complex society, had never built great monuments, or developed sophisticated systems of thought, then colonial rule could be seen as a necessary and civilizing force. History itself was weaponized and rewritten to serve the political and economic agendas of empire. The case of Egypt was absolutely critical to this project. If the magnificent civilization of the pharaohs was acknowledged as a truly African achievement, the entire ideological edifice of colonialism would begin to crumble. It would prove that Africans did possess a glorious past and, by extension, had the inherent potential for a self-determined future. Therefore, separating Egypt from Africa was not just an academic imperative, it was a political necessity for the colonial powers. The theory that a Caucasian or Hamitic race brought civilization to the Nile Valley provided the perfect solution. It allowed Europe to claim Egypt's legacy as part of its own heritage, while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that indigenous Africans were passive recipients of culture, not its creators. In this way, science became a powerful political tool, lending an air of objective authority to the imperial project. The archaeologist's trowel and the anthropologist's calipers became instruments of colonial power, used to carve up history just as politicians were carving up the continent. The racial frameworks established in the 19th century created a lasting distortion, one that placed Egypt in a historical no man's land, geographically in Africa, but culturally and racially relocated to the Near East or the Mediterranean. This act of historical appropriation served the needs of empire and its legacy would shape the field of Egyptology for more than a century, creating a distorted narrative that scholars are still working to correct today. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the treasure-hunting free-for-all that had characterized early archaeology in Egypt was beginning to give way to a more rigorous and professional discipline. At the heart of this transformation was the towering figure of Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, a man often hailed as the father of modern Egyptology. Petrie was a true pioneer, introducing meticulous and systematic excavation methods that really, revolutionized the field. Unlike his predecessors, who were often just seeking spectacular museum pieces, he understood that the true historical value lay not just in golden artifacts, but in the humble, everyday objects, the pottery shards, the beads, the tools. He carefully recorded the stratigraphic layers of his dig sites, allowing him to create a relative chronology of ancient Egyptian history. Petrie's methodological contributions were immense and laid the groundwork for all subsequent archaeological work in the region. His system of sequence dating, which used the changing styles of pottery to date different historical periods, was a brilliant innovation that brought scientific order to a chaotic jumble of artifacts. He trained a generation of archaeologists, instilling in them a respect for careful record-keeping, detailed publication, and the preservation of all finds, no matter how mundane they seemed. His work brought a new level of professionalism and scientific credibility to Egyptology, moving it away from romantic adventure and toward a more sober academic pursuit of the past, earning him a deserved reputation for rigor and precision. However, Petrie was also a man of his time, and his thinking was deeply steeped in the prevailing racial theories of the late Victorian era. He was a firm believer in eugenics, the pseudoscientific movement that advocated for improving the genetic quality of the human population, and he viewed history through the lens of racial conflict and hierarchy. While his excavation techniques were objective and scientific, his interpretations of his findings were anything but. He brought the same level of authority and conviction from his scientific work to his racial theories, giving them an academic weight they would not otherwise have carried. His immense stature in the field meant that his ideas about the racial identity of the ancient Egyptians were not seen as mere speculation, but as authoritative conclusions. This fusion of revolutionary scientific method with deeply ingrained racial prejudice created a powerful and paradoxical legacy. Petrie's meticulous work on the ground gave him an unparalleled command of the material evidence, lending his broader theories an almost unassailable credibility. When he spoke about the origins of Egyptian civilization, people listened, assuming his conclusions were as sound as his archaeological techniques. He therefore became the single most important figure in translating the abstract racial hierarchies of Morton and Cuvier into a concrete historical narrative for ancient Egypt. He provided the archaeological proof that the founders of pharaonic civilization could not have been native Africans, an idea that would dominate Egyptology for the better part of a century. Confronted with the same paradox as Morton, a highly advanced civilization on African soil, Flinders Petrie developed a comprehensive and influential historical narrative to explain it away. Based on his interpretation of skeletal remains and changes in pottery and tomb architecture at the dawn of Egyptian history, he formulated what became known as the Dynastic Race Theory. Petrie argued that the spectacular rise of the first dynasty around 3100 BCE was not the result of a long indigenous process of development by the local Nile Valley inhabitants. Instead, he proposed that it was the direct result of a foreign invasion. A new, intellectually superior race, he claimed, had swept into Egypt from the east, conquering the native population and bringing civilization with them. This invading group, which he called the dynastic race or followers of Horus, was, in Petri's view, racially distinct from and superior to the indigenous pre-dynastic peoples. He described these newcomers as a more energetic, intelligent, and organized group, likening them to other conquering peoples in history. He looked for their origins not in Africa, but eastward, speculating they came from Mesopotamia, or perhaps even a lost land in the Red Sea. He based this on subtle differences he observed in skulls, which he believed showed a larger brain capacity, and on the sudden appearance of more sophisticated artistic motifs and architectural forms like recessed brick paneling, which he saw as foreign imports rather than local innovations. This theory was exactly the kind of story that European and American audiences of the colonial era wanted to hear. It provided a neat and tidy explanation for Egypt's greatness that sidestepped the uncomfortable implications of a great African civilization. It affirmed the belief that progress was carried by dynamic, conquering races, while native populations were passive and stagnant until acted upon by an outside force. The dynastic race theory allowed the West to admire the pharaohs without having to admire Africans. It perfectly mirrored the colonial worldview, where European powers saw themselves as a modern-day dynastic race, bringing progress and order to a continent they viewed as primitive and unchanging. Petri's authority ensured that this theory became Egyptological dogma for decades. It was taught in universities, published in leading journals, and presented as fact in museums around the world. The founders of one of the world's greatest ancient civilizations were thus officially classified as foreign invaders of non-African origin. The theory effectively decapitated Egyptian civilization from its African body, attributing its head, its intelligence, creativity, and organizational genius to an external, lighter-skinned source. The contributions of the indigenous people of the Nile Valley were minimized, reduced to providing the raw material and labor upon which a superior race built its magnificent culture. History was rewritten to fit the prejudices of the present. The dynastic race theory was more than just an academic hypothesis. It was a fundamental remapping of the ancient world in the Western imagination. By attributing the genesis of pharaonic civilization to foreign invaders from the East, Petri and his followers effectively performed a mental and cultural relocation of Egypt. Geographically, Egypt was undeniably in Africa, a physical reality that could not be changed. But in the historical narrative constructed by 19th and 20th century Egyptology, it was lifted out of its continental context and placed firmly within a different story. It became the easternmost outpost of a greater Mediterranean world, or the westernmost extension of the Fertile Crescent of the ancient Near East. This intellectual maneuver was crucial for maintaining the racial and cultural hierarchies of the time. In this new framework, Africa was defined as the Dark Continent, a place of primitivism, raw materials, and cheap labor, but not of history, innovation, or civilization itself. Egypt, with its undeniable greatness, had to be an exception. It was framed as a part of the Orient, a term that carried its own set of exotic and often patronizing connotations, but which crucially separated it from the supposedly savage lands south of the Sahara. The story of civilization was now a neat line of succession. It began in Mesopotamia, was passed to Egypt, then to Greece, then to Rome, and finally culminated in the modern nations of Western Europe. Africa was written out of the script, This narrative was powerfully reinforced by the way knowledge was organized and presented. Museums built separate galleries for Egyptian artifacts, carefully distinguishing them from their African ethnology collections, which were often filled with objects labeled as primitive art. University departments were structured to reflect this division, with Egyptology housed alongside classics or Near Eastern studies, while the rest of Africa was relegated to anthropology. This academic segregation ensured that generations of scholars studied Egypt in isolation from its African neighbors, particularly from Nubia to the south, which was often wrongly depicted as a mere colonial backwater that passively received Egyptian culture rather than a powerful and sophisticated African civilization in its own right. The result was a profound and lasting distortion. The deep connections that linked Egypt to the rest of the Nile Valley and the African continent through trade, warfare, migration, and cultural exchange over millennia were rendered invisible. The possibility that pharaonic civilization was itself a profoundly African creation, born of peoples and cultures native to the continent, was dismissed as an absurdity. Egypt was mentally cordoned off, its history claimed as a preface to the story of Europe. Its African identity was not just ignored, it was actively erased in a concerted effort to make the ancient world safe for the racial ideologies of the colonial era, leaving a legacy of misrepresentation that, honestly, persists to this day. The ideas formulated by scholars like Petri did not remain confined to academic circles. They were actively disseminated to the public, where they became entrenched as common knowledge. The primary vehicle for this transmission was the public museum. In the grand halls of the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, vast collections of Egyptian antiquities were put on display for millions of visitors. These exhibits were not neutral presentations of artifacts. They were powerful storytelling devices that subtly and effectively communicated the dominant racial narrative. The descriptions on plaques, the organization of galleries, and the focus of the exhibits all work together to reinforce the idea of Egypt as a non-African civilization. The physical separation of collections was a key tool in this process. Visitors would walk through galleries dedicated to the glories of Egypt, then move to entirely different sections of the museum to see artifacts from Black Africa, which were often presented in a way that emphasized their supposed primitivism or exotic strangeness. This spatial arrangement created a powerful cognitive dissonance, making it almost impossible for the average museum goer to connect the builders of the pyramids with the peoples of the rest of the continent. The message was clear and unambiguous. These were two different worlds inhabited by two different types of people, one capable of monumental history and the other trapped in an unchanging, timeless present. Popular media further cemented these ideas in the public mind. Newspapers and magazines were filled with thrilling accounts of archaeological discoveries, often accompanied by illustrations that depicted the ancient Egyptians with distinctly European features. Hollywood films, from Cecil B. DeMille's epics to later mummy movies, consistently cast white actors in the roles of pharaohs, queens, and priests, solidifying a visual image of a Caucasian Egypt. This constant cultural reinforcement made the notion of a Black African Egypt seem not just unlikely, but utterly preposterous. The lie was repeated so often and through so many channels that it became an unquestionable truth for generations. This carefully constructed narrative served a vital psychological purpose for Western societies. It allowed them to marvel at Egypt's achievements while simultaneously justifying colonial domination over other parts of Africa. The greatness of the pharaohs could be admired because they were seen as one of us, a distant branch of the same Caucasian family tree. This established a historical claim over Egypt's legacy, framing its artifacts not as looted cultural heritage, but as treasures belonging to a shared world civilization for which Europe was the natural custodian. The museum, the textbook, and the cinema all became instruments in this great historical deception, shaping the minds of millions and ensuring that Egypt's African face remained hidden from view. For the better part of a century, the narrative of a Caucasian Egypt was constructed and maintained almost exclusively by European and American scholars. The debate over Egypt's identity was a conversation that took place without African voices, as the continent was still largely under colonial rule, its intellectuals lacking the institutional platforms to challenge the dominant Western consensus. However, as African nations began to gain their independence in the mid-20th century, a new generation of scholars emerged, armed with a decolonized perspective and a determination to reclaim their own history. Among these powerful new voices, none was more formidable or revolutionary than that of Cheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese historian, anthropologist, physicist, and politician who would dedicate his life to restoring Egypt to its rightful place in Africa. Diop was a true polymath whose diverse academic training in fields ranging from nuclear physics to linguistics and history gave him a uniquely comprehensive toolkit for interrogating the past. Studying in Paris in the post-war years, he was struck by the pervasive intellectual denial of Africa's historical achievements. He saw the separation of ancient Egypt from the rest of Africa not as a sound academic conclusion, but as a politically motivated falsehood designed to legitimize colonial ideology. He embarked on a lifelong scholarly mission to demolish this falsehood, meticulously gathering evidence from a vast array of disciplines to prove the profound and foundational connections between pharaonic civilization and other Black African cultures. His work was not just academic, it was an act of political and cultural liberation. His groundbreaking doctoral dissertation, which argued for the Black African origins of Egyptian civilization, was initially rejected by the Sorbonne in 1951 for being too polemical, a clear sign of the academic establishment's resistance to his ideas. Undeterred, he published his research in the influential book Nations Négres et Culture, Black Nations and Culture, in 1955, a work that became a foundational text for Afrocentric scholarship. In it, Diop systematically dismantled the arguments for a Caucasian Egypt, presenting a wealth of linguistic, cultural, and anthropological data to support his thesis. He argued that ancient Egyptian was not a Semitic or Hamitic language, but was genetically related to modern West African languages, like his own native Wolof. Diop's work represented a direct and audacious challenge to the entire edifice of Eurocentric Egyptology. He was not merely suggesting minor corrections to the existing framework, he was proposing to tear it down and rebuild it on an entirely new African-centered foundation. He asserted that ancient Egypt was not just in Africa, but was fundamentally of Africa, a civilization created by Black people whose legacy was the shared heritage of the entire continent. For decades, his work was largely ignored or dismissed by the Western academic mainstream, but it galvanized African and African diaspora intellectuals. It would take nearly 20 years for him to get the chance to present his evidence on a global stage, directly confronting the scholars who had for so long controlled the narrative. The opportunity for a direct confrontation finally arrived in 1974. In a landmark event, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, convened an international symposium in Cairo. The official topic was the peopling of ancient Egypt and the deciphering of the Meroitic script. The goal was to bring together the world's leading experts to have a frank and scholarly discussion on the very questions that had haunted the field for a century. Who were the ancient Egyptians? What was their ethnic origin? And how did their civilization relate to the rest of Africa? For the first time, African scholars would meet the titans of Western Egyptology on neutral ground, not as students or subordinates, but as equals in a formal academic debate. The symposium was a veritable who's who of the field. 20 of the world's most renowned Egyptologists and specialists from across the globe were invited to participate. The established Western institutions were well represented by figures who largely upheld the traditional view of Egypt as a multiracial society with a predominantly Mediterranean or Near Eastern ruling class. Representing the challenging African perspective were Cheikh Anta Diop himself and his brilliant Congolese colleague Théophile Obenga, a linguist and historian from the University of Brazzaville. The atmosphere in the Cairo conference hall was thick with anticipation and intellectual tension. The stage was set for a historic clash of ideas, a scholarly battle over the identity of one of the world's most ancient and influential civilizations. When it was his turn to speak, Cheikh Anta Diop did not hold back. He and Obenga came meticulously prepared, not with fiery rhetoric or political appeals, but with a mountain of empirical evidence drawn from multiple independent lines of inquiry. They presented their findings systematically, laying out a comprehensive case for the black African origins of the Egyptian people, their language and their culture. They cited evidence from physical anthropology based on melanin dosage tests, from art history by analyzing the features on statues and reliefs, from the linguistic structures of ancient Egyptian, and from the eyewitness accounts of ancient Greek and Roman writers like Herodotus, who had described the Egyptians as having black skin and woolly hair. The presentation was a bombshell. Diop and Obenga were not simply repeating old arguments. They were marshalling scientific and humanistic data in a way that the Western Egyptological establishment had never been forced to confront so directly. They were using the very tools of Western scholarship, linguistics, anthropology, textual analysis, to deconstruct its most cherished conclusions about Egypt. They argued that if the evidence were examined without the distorting lens of racial prejudice, the conclusion was inescapable. Ancient Egypt was a Negro-African civilization. The Cairo Symposium was no longer a polite academic discussion. It had become a trial, and the historical soul of Egypt was hanging in the balance. At the heart of Diop's presentation was this really disciplined, multi-pronged scientific methodology, designed to overwhelm his critics with a convergence of evidence. One of his most innovative and controversial arguments actually came from the field of physical anthropology. Diop proposed a method to objectively determine the skin color of the ancient Egyptians by measuring the levels of melanin preserved in the skin of royal mummies. He argued that a microscopic analysis would reveal high concentrations of melanin, which is the pigment responsible for dark skin, and that this would conclusively prove their black racial identity. Now, even though the Egyptian authorities at the time refused to allow samples to be taken from the mummies for this test, the very proposal itself was a direct scientific challenge to those subjective interpretations of skin color based on faded tomb paintings. But Diop didn't just stop at biology. Along with Obenga, he presented a really powerful linguistic case. They demonstrated numerous and profound grammatical and lexical similarities between the language of the pharaohs and modern African languages, especially those in the Wolof group. They showed cognates, or words with a common origin, and even more importantly, deep structural parallels in syntax and morphology that just couldn't be explained by mere borrowing. They argued that ancient Egyptian wasn't part of the Afro-Asiatic family as it was traditionally classified, but was instead a classic Negro-African language. For scholars, language is a key marker of cultural and ethnic affiliation, and this linguistic evidence really struck at the very root of the theory that separated Egypt from the rest of the continent. The historical evidence they presented was equally compelling. Diop compiled an exhaustive list of testimonials from early Greek and Latin authors who had traveled to Egypt in antiquity. He quoted Herodotus, Aristotle, Strabo, and Diodorus of Sicily, all of whom described the ancient Egyptians in terms that clearly indicated a black population. Diop argued that these eyewitness accounts from antiquity, written long before the racial biases of the colonial era, should be given far more weight than the self-serving theories of 19th century scholars. Why, he asked, should the Academy trust the conclusions of a slave-owning society over the direct observations of the ancient Greeks who saw the Egyptians firsthand? Finally, Diop pointed to cultural continuity. He highlighted a vast array of shared cultural traits between ancient Egypt and other African societies, including matriarchy, totemism, circumcision, kingship rituals, and cosmological beliefs. He argued that these were not just superficial resemblances, but deep structural elements pointing to a common African cultural substratum. By weaving together evidence from Melanin, linguistics, classical texts, and cultural anthropology, Diop and Obenga presented a holistic and honestly formidable case. They weren't just making a claim, they were presenting a thoroughly researched scientific thesis that really demanded a serious intellectual response from the Egyptological establishment. The reaction to the presentations by Diop and Obenga was immediate and deeply polarized, revealing just how profound the political and emotional stakes of the debate really were. The final report of the symposium actually acknowledged the force of their arguments, noting that the Egyptian civilization was fundamentally African in its language, culture, and population. Several participants were swayed, and the African scholars present hailed the event as a monumental victory, a successful reclaiming of history on the world stage. For them, Diop and Obenga had not only presented a compelling case, but had also demonstrated the intellectual vitality of post-colonial African scholarship. They had spoken truth to power and forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the discipline's racist past. However, many of the leading Western Egyptologists remained staunchly unconvinced, and their reactions ranged from polite dismissal to outright hostility. Some critics tried to engage with the evidence, but often did so by picking at minor details while ignoring the weight of the overall convergence of proof. Others simply refused to engage at all, falling back on the long-established consensus as if no serious challenge had been mounted. The French professor Jean Leclanc, for example, concluded that the Egyptians were neither black nor white, but a mixed population, a safe and non-committal position that effectively sidestepped the core of Diop's thesis. The symposium ultimately ended in a stalemate, famously characterized by Diop himself as a dialogue of the deaf. The two sides seemed to be speaking past each other, operating from fundamentally different paradigms. For Diop and Obenga, the evidence for Egypt's Black African identity was overwhelming and clear once the blinders of colonial-era prejudice were removed. For many of their opponents, the idea was so contrary to 2 centuries of established scholarship that it was almost unthinkable. They saw Diop's work not as objective science, but as a politically motivated Afrocentric project, failing to recognize the political motivations that had shaped their own Eurocentric narratives for generations. Despite the lack of a final consensus, the 1974 Cairo Symposium was a watershed moment. It shattered the illusion of a monolithic, unquestioned truth in Egyptology and publicly legitimized the African-centered perspective as a serious and evidence-based school of thought. It placed the question of Egypt's racial identity firmly on the international academic agenda, where it could no longer be ignored or relegated to the fringe. Cheikh Anta Diop and Théophile Obenga had successfully fired a shot across the bow of the establishment. While they didn't win the battle outright, they had irrevocably changed the terms of the debate, opening a door through which a new generation of scholars would march in the decades to come. Several years after the Cairo Symposium, the very foundations of the race science that had shaped Egyptology came under a powerful and public attack, not from a historian of Africa, but from one of America's most prominent evolutionary biologists. In 1981, the Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould published his landmark book. It was a brilliant and honestly scathing critique of biological determinism, the idea that social and economic differences between human groups arise from inherited inborn distinctions. At the heart of his book was a direct and meticulous re-examination of the work of the 19th century's most influential race scientist, Samuel George Morton, the man whose skull measurements had provided the so-called hard data for ranking human intelligence and for classifying the ancient Egyptians as Caucasian. Gould's work was a bombshell dropped into the ongoing debate about race, intelligence, and the objectivity of science itself. He didn't just dismiss Morton's conclusions, he actually went back to the source. Gould obtained Morton's original raw data and reanalyzed his collection of skulls, meticulously remeasuring and recalculating the figures that had served as the bedrock of American physical anthropology for over a century. His goal was to investigate a crucial question: had Morton's science been a case of outright deliberate fraud, or was something more subtle at play? Gould's investigation sought to understand not just what Morton got wrong, but how and why he got it wrong, providing a powerful case study in the pathology of scientific error. Gould's devastating conclusion was that Morton's research was riddled with unconscious bias and a kind of finagling of data that consistently steered the results toward his preconceived notions of a racial hierarchy. He found no evidence of conscious fraud, which he argued made the case even more troubling. Morton, a respected scientist of his day, had simply been a prisoner of his own unexamined assumptions. Gould discovered that Morton had selectively included or excluded certain skulls to inflate the averages for Caucasians and decrease them for Africans. He had failed to account for crucial variables like body size and sex, since men naturally have larger skulls than women, for instance, and had made convenient rounding errors, all in the service of confirming the expected outcome. The critique was profound because it exposed the myth of perfect scientific objectivity. Gould argued that Morton's famous cranial rankings were not a discovery of natural fact, but were instead a projection of social prejudices. The numbers did not speak for themselves. They were made to speak in a voice that echoed the biases of the society they came from, became a pivotal text, arming a new generation of scholars and the public with the intellectual tools to question and dismantle the pseudo-scientific arguments that had long been used to justify racism and inequality. It demonstrated that the science used to remove Egypt from Africa was not just outdated, but had been flawed from its very inception. Stephen Jay Gould's work highlighted a problem far more pervasive and insidious than deliberate scientific fraud, the power of unconscious bias. He argued that scientists, like all human beings, are products of their culture and time. They carry a lifetime of assumptions, social conditioning, and unexamined beliefs with them into the laboratory. These biases can act like a ghost in the machine, subtly influencing every stage of the scientific process, from the questions a researcher chooses to ask, to the methods they employ, to the way they interpret ambiguous results. When the subject of study is as emotionally and politically charged as human race, the risk of this unconscious finagling becomes almost unavoidable. Gould showed that Morton's desire to see a certain outcome, a world neatly ordered into a racial hierarchy, led him to find exactly that. This wasn't because he was a bad person or a dishonest scientist, but because he was looking for confirmation of what he and his society already considered to be an obvious truth. Science is supposed to be a self-correcting enterprise, but when an entire community of researchers shares the same biases, those errors can become entrenched and amplified, laundered into objective fact. The case of Morton's skulls became the perfect illustration of how easily data can be molded by expectation, especially when the results align with the prevailing structures of power. In the decades following Gould's publication, his specific statistical analysis of Morton's work was itself challenged. In 2011, a team of physical anthropologists remeasured the skulls yet again and argued that Gould, too, had allowed his own biases to influence his analysis, claiming Morton's measurements were actually more accurate than Gould had allowed. This follow-up study was often trumpeted by critics as a complete refutation of Gould's work. However, this counter-argument completely missed the forest for the trees. The new study even confirmed that Morton's racial categories themselves were arbitrary and that there was no link whatsoever between his measurements and any meaningful concept of intelligence. The larger, more important point that Gould made remained entirely intact and more relevant than ever. Science is not performed in a social vacuum. The Morton-Gould debate reinforced the central message that science is a human activity, susceptible to all the flaws of human cognition. The very act of classifying people into broad racial categories like Caucasian or Ethiopian, and then trying to rank them, is an inherently unscientific and politically motivated project. The lingering controversy only served to underscore the extreme difficulty of producing truly objective knowledge when the subject is ourselves, especially when questions of race and hierarchy are involved, a lesson that lies at the very heart of the historical misclassification of ancient Egypt. While the science of measuring skulls to determine intelligence has been thoroughly debunked and discredited within mainstream academia, its shadow lingers. The legacy of 19th century race science has proven to be remarkably resilient, continuing to surface in modern political discourse and on the fringes of the internet. The simplistic idea that human populations can be neatly ranked by intelligence with genetics as the driving factor has a persistent and dangerous appeal. This modern iteration of scientific racism often dresses itself up in the sophisticated language of genetics and IQ studies, but it is merely the old wine of Morton and Petri poured into new, more technologically advanced bottles. It continues to feed narratives of racial grievance and superiority. This legacy directly impacts how the history of ancient Egypt is still debated today. The old theories of a Caucasian or Mediterranean Egypt, though abandoned by most serious scholars, remain popular in certain circles and are often invoked to deny any connection between ancient Egypt and Black Africa. These arguments are no longer propped up by skull measurements, but they rely on the same foundational assumption that a civilization of such magnitude could not have been an indigenous African creation. The pseudoscientific ideas of the past laid down such deep cultural tracks that they continue to guide popular thinking even after the scientific engine has been dismantled. The story of the mismeasure of man serves as a crucial cautionary tale for both scientists and the public. It reminds us that scientific claims, especially those about human differences, must be met with a healthy dose of skepticism. We must always ask who is funding the research, what are the underlying assumptions of the researchers, and whose interests do the conclusions serve. The authority of science is immense, and when that authority is used to bolster social prejudice, the consequences can be devastating and long-lasting. The misclassification of the ancient Egyptians is one of history's most potent examples of this process in action, a distortion that has taken more than a century to begin to correct. Ultimately, the revisiting of race science forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The problem was not just a few biased scientists in the past. The problem is the very idea that humanity can be sorted into a meaningful biological hierarchy. Modern genetics has shown that the old racial categories have no scientific basis. Human variation is gradual and complex, not divided into a few neat boxes. The effort to rank these socially constructed groups has always been a political project masquerading as science. The legacy of Morton's mismeasure is a powerful reminder that when science is used to build walls between people, it's essential to look closely at the foundations. More often than not, they are built on the shifting sands of prejudice. In the wake of the intellectual battles waged by scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop and Stephen Jay Gould, a new and transformative movement has been gaining momentum within the field of archaeology. Today, a growing number of researchers are actively working to break down the artificial wall that 19th century race science erected between Egypt and the rest of the African continent. They are rejecting the outdated and biased narratives of the past, which viewed Egypt in isolation or as an extension of the Near East. Instead, they are pursuing a more holistic and accurate approach, one that firmly situates the civilization of the pharaohs within its true geographical, cultural, and historical African context, revealing a story far richer and more complex than previously told. A key focus of this modern scholarship is the relationship between ancient Egypt and its southern neighbor, Nubia, a powerful African civilization located in what is now modern Sudan. For generations, traditional Egyptology depicted Nubia as a primitive backwater, a mere source of raw materials, and a passive recipient of Egyptian cultural influence. However, archaeologists like Stuart Tyson Smith and others have completely overturned this colonial era caricature. Their meticulous excavations have revealed a dynamic and deeply intertwined relationship spanning millennia. characterized by a vibrant two-way exchange of culture, technology, language, and people. This was not a simple case of a dominant Egypt and a subordinate Nubia. It was a complex dance of rivals, partners, and at times even conquerors. The evidence from the ground paints a clear picture of this profound connection. We now know that Nubian kingdoms, like the powerful Kerma culture, were sophisticated political and military rivals to Egypt long before the New Kingdom. Later, during Egypt's 25th dynasty, it was Nubian pharaohs from the Kingdom of Kush who conquered and ruled over Egypt, seeing themselves not as foreign invaders, but as restorers of traditional Egyptian religious and cultural values. This powerful historical reality directly contradicts the old dynastic race narrative. It demonstrates that a technologically advanced, politically sophisticated, and culturally rich Black African civilization not only coexisted with Egypt, but was deeply entangled with it, even ruling it at the height of its power. This renewed focus on the Egyptian-Nubian relationship is fundamentally reshaping our understanding of how civilization developed in the Nile Valley. It is no longer possible to see Egypt's achievements as having sprung fully formed from a Caucasian or Near Eastern source. The evidence now shows that pharaonic civilization was part of a much wider African world, constantly interacting with, learning from, and contributing to the diverse cultures to its south. By tearing down the wall between Egypt and Nubia, modern scholars are not just correcting a historical inaccuracy, they are restoring a vital piece of Africa's story, showing the Nile not as a border, but as a highway that connected a vast and brilliant network of African peoples. The scholarly effort to reconnect Egypt with its African roots is part of a much broader and more profound movement, sweeping across the humanities, the push to decolonize the discipline. This is a conscious and deliberate effort to move away from the historical narratives that were constructed in the 19th and 20th centuries, many of which were created to serve the interests of European empire. Decolonizing archaeology means critically examining the biases baked into the very foundations of the field, the unquestioned assumptions, the loaded terminology, and the Eurocentric perspectives that have long been mistaken for objective truth. It involves questioning who gets to tell the story of the past and whose history is considered important enough to study. A central part of this process is amplifying the voices and perspectives of scholars from the regions being studied. For too long, the story of Africa has been told almost exclusively by outsiders. The decolonization movement seeks to change this by centering the work of African archaeologists, historians, and heritage professionals. These scholars often bring new questions, different interpretive frameworks, and a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the local cultural context. Their involvement is not just a matter of equity and inclusion, it leads to better, more accurate, and more meaningful science, enriching the field with insights that were previously overlooked or dismissed by the Western academic establishment. This movement also involves a radical rethinking of how ancient cultures are presented to the public in museums and in the media. Decolonizing the museum means confronting the legacy of colonial collecting practices and rewriting display labels to tell a more complete and honest story. It means acknowledging the biases of past interpretations and presenting artifacts not as trophies of Western discovery, but as the rich cultural heritage of living communities. It is about shifting the narrative from one of us discovering them to a more collaborative and respectful engagement with the world's diverse histories, returning a sense of ownership and agency to the descendants of the people who created these magnificent civilizations. Ultimately, decolonizing Egyptology is not about replacing one simplistic narrative with another. It is not about claiming Egypt was exclusively black in a modern American racial sense, but about acknowledging its foundational identity as an indigenous African civilization with all the diversity and complexity that entails. It is a commitment to following the full range of evidence, archaeological, linguistic, and cultural, wherever it may lead, free from the distorting influence of colonial-era racial hierarchies. This ongoing process promises to reveal a truer and far more fascinating story of ancient Egypt, one that finally restores it to its rightful place as a shining star in the vast constellation of African history. The long and contentious struggle over the true identity of ancient Egypt is about far more than settling an academic debate. The stakes have always been immensely higher, resonating far beyond the quiet halls of universities and museums. During the colonial era, the systematic denial of Africa's role in creating one of the world's foundational civilizations was a cornerstone of imperial ideology. It was part of a deliberate psychological campaign to justify domination and exploitation. The logic was that a people with no great past could have no legitimate claim to a self-determined future. History was weaponized, and the erasure of Egypt from Africa's story was a profound wound inflicted upon the continent's psyche. By framing the ancient Egyptians as a Caucasian or Mediterranean people, Western scholarship provided a convenient rationale for colonial rule. It reinforced the narrative that progress and civilization were the exclusive properties of the white race, while Africa was a continent of stagnation and inferiority. This historical falsehood was used to legitimize the subjugation of millions, creating a deep-seated legacy of internalized inferiority that has persisted for generations. Reclaiming the history of Egypt is not just about correcting the record. It is an act of profound cultural and political liberation. It is about restoring a stolen heritage and affirming that the genius that built the pyramids is part of the birthright of all African peoples. Restoring Egypt to its rightful African context does not diminish its achievements. It enriches and deepens our understanding of them. It reveals pharaonic civilization not as an inexplicable miracle, but as the magnificent culmination of millennia of indigenous African development. It connects the story of the Nile Valley to the broader tapestry of African history, revealing a continent of incredible diversity, innovation, and interconnectedness. This more accurate view finally allows us to appreciate the full scope of Egypt's legacy and its profound relationships with neighbors like the powerful Nubian kingdoms. It returns ownership of the story to the descendants whose ancestors actually lived it. The journey to uncover the hidden truths of Egyptology is a powerful testament to the resilience of history. For over a century, scientific racism shaped how the entire world saw Africa, creating a distorted narrative that served the powerful. But history is not a static monument carved in stone. It is a living, evolving conversation. By courageously confronting the biases of the past, by amplifying the voices of African scholars, and by following the evidence wherever it leads, we can tell a truer, richer, and more just story. Ancient Egypt is not a mystery that belongs to the West. It is a vital part of Africa's living heritage, and it is time we all saw it that way.